It was supposed to be just another routine flight. Delta Flight 1823, a Boeing 737, was en route to Toronto Pearson International Airport, one of the busiest airports in North America. The aircraft had safely transported passengers countless times before. On board were 153 passengers, along with Captain Michael Reynolds, First Officer Daniel Carter, and the rest of the crew. Each person on board had their own reason for traveling. Some were heading home to see their families, others were on business trips, and a few were first-time travelers excited about their journey. No one expected the horror that was about to unfold. As the aircraft approached Toronto, conditions were far from ideal. Heavy snowfall and icy runways made the approach particularly challenging. Pilots train for these situations, but no amount of preparation can fully eliminate the risks of extreme weather. At Pearson Airport, flights were already being delayed and air traffic control was carefully monitoring each landing. They had their eyes on Delta Flight 1823, making sure it had a safe path to the runway. Inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer Daniel Carter were locked in, focused on the approach. They were in constant communication with air traffic control, making adjustments as needed. At this point, everything still seemed under control. But was there a warning sign? Were the pilots already sensing trouble? Passengers inside the cabin were mostly unaware of any danger. Many were listening to music, watching movies, or looking out the window, seeing the bright city lights of Toronto below. A few might have noticed how the plane seemed to be shaking a bit more than usual, but turbulence is normal. Nothing to be alarmed about. The flight attendants were preparing for landing, making their final rounds and checking seatbelts. Then, something changed. The plane was now just minutes from touchdown. But this wasn't like any other landing. The aircraft was coming in too fast. Or was it too slow? Did Captain Michael Reynolds misjudge their descent? Or did the harsh weather suddenly worsen at the worst possible moment? A crucial question arises. Was there a distress call? Did the pilots at any point realize they were in trouble and try to warn air traffic control? If so, what did they say? Were they battling fierce winds, struggling with slippery runways? Or was there an issue with the plane itself? For the passengers, those final moments must have felt routine, until they weren't. The runway was in sight. The wheels were seconds away from touching the ground. But in those final critical moments, something went horribly wrong. Instead of a normal landing, the aircraft skidded off the runway, failed to stop in time, and veered dangerously toward the runway's edge. Panic set in. Screams filled the cabin, oxygen masks deployed. Flight attendants shouted instructions trying to keep everyone calm. And outside, emergency responders were already racing toward the scene, unsure of what they would find. What had just happened? Was this a simple case of human error, an issue with the aircraft, or something far worse? What investigators would later uncover would shock everyone. The tension in the cabin of Delta Flight 1823 was palpable as the aircraft descended toward Toronto Pearson International Airport. It had been a routine flight from Atlanta, and everything seemed on track for a smooth landing. However, as the plane neared the runway, things took a sharp turn for the worse. The usual sound of the engines preparing for touchdown was interrupted by a sudden, unexpected shake, a sign that something was wrong. Captain Michael Reynolds, an experienced pilot with over 15 years in the cockpit, was fully focused on the final approach. With his hand firmly on the controls, he glanced at first Officer Daniel Carter, who was monitoring the instruments. But despite their best efforts, the weather conditions that day were making things more difficult than usual. The runway was slick with rain, and visibility was low, a combination that made landing harder than expected. As the wheels hit the runway, the plane jolted. A hard landing, much harder than normal, sent the passengers and crew into a brief moment of confusion. The aircraft's wheels screamed against the wet tarmac, and the screeching sound echoed through the cabin. Then came the most unsettling sensation. The plane began to skid, its movements uncoordinated and violent. It wasn't just a rough landing. It was an uncontrolled slide toward the edge of the runway. Inside the cabin, panic spread quickly. Passengers gripped their seats, some screaming in terror while others prayed silently. The The flight attendants did their best to remain calm, but the sudden chaos left little time for them to react. Oxygen masks dropped from their compartments above, hanging like ominous warnings of the growing danger. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" one of the flight attendants shouted, her voice barely audible over the wailing sirens outside. The message was clear. This wasn't just a rough landing. Something had gone terribly wrong. From the cockpit, Captain Reynolds fought with the controls, his hands moving swiftly but with increasing desperation. The plane was losing speed, but not in the way he had hoped. The brakes weren't responding as they should, and the wheels weren't gripping the surface. First Officer Carter tried to help, pushing buttons to adjust the aircraft's systems. But it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. The plane veered off the runway, its tail end swinging dangerously close to the grass, and for a moment, it seemed as if the jet might tip over. Meanwhile, outside, the control tower was already reacting to the emergency. The operators had been watching the plane's erratic descent and landing, and within seconds of seeing the plane veer off the runway, they radioed the cockpit. "Delta 1823, do you copy?" they called, hoping to get a response. The tower's concern grew as the communication was not returned immediately, leaving them fearing the worst. They quickly dispatched fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency teams to the scene, knowing they would need all hands on deck. The plane continued to slide, the sound of its tires scraping against the runway filling the air. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. Just moments later, a loud bang echoed as the left wing of the aircraft struck an uneven patch of ground. That jolt was enough to send the plane off balance, causing its landing gear to give way under the weight of the plane. The right wing was now dangerously close to hitting the grass, and the aircraft seemed to have no way of stopping. Finally, the plane came to a halt, just inches from the runway's edge. But the danger was far from over. The sound of crackling metal and the faint scent of smoke filled the cabin. A fire had started near the left engine, adding a new layer of urgency to the situation. Flight attendants quickly jumped into action, opening the emergency exits as the alarms blared. The passengers, still in shock, were now urged to evacuate as quickly as possible. As the passengers hurried to leave, some were injured, others too stunned to move at first. A few limped down the emergency slides while others were assisted by the crew. Among the passengers, there were a couple of broken bones and some minor burns. But thankfully, the fire was quickly contained by emergency crews who had arrived within minutes. Outside, fire trucks, paramedics, and airport security were swarming the scene, securing the area and preparing to transport the injured. The rescue teams worked swiftly, guiding everyone away from the wreckage as they worked to extinguish any remaining flames and assess the damage to the plane. The aftermath was chaotic, but the fact that there were no fatalities was a small miracle. The initial shock had subsided, but the questions were just beginning. What had gone wrong during the landing? Was it the weather, a mechanical failure, or something else? The incident would be investigated thoroughly in the days to come, but in that moment, all that mattered was the safety of the passengers and crew. In the moments after the crash, emergency responders sprang into action. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police raced towards the scene of Delta Flight 1823, lights flashing in the dark, while the ground crew scrambled to assess the damage. Within minutes, first responders reached the plane, quickly focusing on evacuating the passengers and ensuring there was no further danger of fire or explosions. As the emergency crews worked swiftly, the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier was now replaced by a focused, urgent calm. The runway was closed off, and teams immediately began securing the area, checking for any other planes that might be in danger. The airport's emergency system had kicked into overdrive, but even in such a large-scale response, the impact of the crash was clear. Toronto Pearson was now in a temporary state of lockdown. Inside the plane, the passengers were shaken, their hearts racing as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. Many were still recovering from the terrifying ordeal, their minds replaying the terrifying seconds as the plane skidded off the runway. Some described the scene as nothing short of chaotic, people trying to unbuckle their seatbelts, bags flying, and the sudden deployment of oxygen masks. Passengers like Samantha Mitchell, a business traveler, recalled how the cabin had filled with smoke after the plane came to a stop and how everyone followed instructions from the flight attendants, trying to stay calm. The atmosphere was filled with tension, but also with a strong sense of unity. Strangers helping each other, looking out for one another in the middle of the panic. While there were injuries, many passengers later shared that they were relieved to be alive, despite the emotional toll of what they just experienced. At Toronto Pearson, the crash caused a ripple effect. Flights were delayed for hours as the runway had to be cleared, and authorities began to investigate. The media jumped on the story, with news outlets reporting live from the scene. The images of the plane on the tarmac, surrounded by fire trucks and emergency responders, spread quickly across television and social media. The story took over the headlines for days, with people around the world talking about the crash and what had caused it. The pressure was on for both the airline and the airport to provide answers. As investigators began their work, the questions surrounding the crash grew louder. Was the weather to blame? Was it the icy conditions on the runway that caused the plane to lose control? Or was it a mechanical failure? Some speculated that the plane's braking systems might not have worked as intended, while others suggested that the pilots could have misjudged their descent due to the challenging weather. There were even whispers of human error, questioning if there had been a lapse in judgment or communication between the flight crew and air traffic control. Initial reports from the airline didn't shed much light on the situation, but the pressure for answers mounted as the investigation continued. Theories began to circulate, and people started piecing together what might have gone wrong. While investigators combed through the wreckage and analyzed the flight data, the public's curiosity and concern grew. Was this a tragic accident waiting to happen? Or was it a rare freak event with many factors playing a role? Each new detail seemed to fuel more questions than answers, and the investigation would take weeks before any clear conclusions could be drawn. For those directly involved, the questions were personal. What had caused the crash? Could it have been prevented? And most importantly, would the survivors be able to move forward from this traumatic event? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that piecing together the truth behind Delta Flight 1823 was going to take time. But for now, one thing was certain. A normal flight had turned into a nightmare, and the survivors were left to process what they had just lived through. The investigation into the Delta Flight 1823 crash was extensive, with the black box playing a crucial role in uncovering what went wrong. The flight data recorder, which captures important information during the flight, was recovered from the wreckage and sent for analysis. When investigators reviewed the data, they noticed some alarming details. The plane's speed was inconsistent as it approached the runway, and there were fluctuations in the braking systems. The aircraft had been coming in too fast, and the pilot, Captain John Edwards, seemed to struggle to slow the plane down in time. Despite the plane's advanced technology and the pilot's training, the data pointed to a serious miscalculation during the final moments of the descent. The black box also revealed that, in the moments before the crash, there was no sign of distress being communicated to air traffic control. This raised questions about whether the pilots recognized the danger too late, or if there had been a technical issue they couldn't fix in time. Further analysis of the aircraft's condition uncovered some troubling findings. While the plane, a Boeing 737, had undergone regular maintenance, there were signs of wear and tear that might have contributed to the crash. Investigators found that the braking system had been showing signs of reduced efficiency in the days leading up to the flight. However, this issue had not been flagged by the airline's maintenance team, and no warning had been issued to the flight crew. Some speculated that the aircraft's brakes may not have functioned as they should have, preventing the pilots from stopping the plane in time once it veered off the runway. There were also reports of problems with the runway's surface, as it had been coated with a thin layer of ice that hadn't been properly addressed before the plane attempted to land. This combination of factors made it much harder for the plane to stop in the short distance it had. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted to the pilot's actions. Did Captain Edwards and First Officer Rachel Adams make a crucial mistake? A deep dive into their communication and decision-making process revealed that they had indeed made some critical errors. During the final approach, they had been briefed on the weather conditions and runway status, but it seems they underestimated the difficulty of landing on such a challenging surface. The investigation found that both pilots had been fatigued due to a long flight schedule, which may have affected their judgment. This, combined with the weather conditions, led to their misjudgment of the plane's speed and distance. In hindsight, it became clear that the pilots could have chosen to delay the landing, but they proceeded despite knowing the conditions were far from ideal. As shocking as these findings were, the ultimate cause of the crash wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of errors, technical failures, and unforeseen circumstances. The investigation revealed that the failure to properly assess the runway conditions, the overestimation of the aircraft's braking capability, and the fatigue of the pilots all played a part in the crash. The final report would go on to highlight that the crash could have been avoided with better decision-making, more thorough maintenance checks, and a clearer understanding of the weather conditions. It was a harsh reminder of the delicate balance involved in air travel, where every decision counts and even the smallest mistake can lead to disaster. In the end, the investigation concluded that Delta Flight 1823's crash was the result of a series of missteps that combined to create a catastrophic outcome. The airline was held accountable for some of the lapses in maintenance, and the pilots, while experienced, were deemed to have made critical errors in judgment under pressure. This tragedy not only raised questions about safety protocols but also about the hidden risks that passengers might never think about when they board a flight. What seemed like a routine trip turned into a nightmare because of a combination of overlooked details, misjudgments, and technical failures. The crash was a devastating reminder of how fragile the balance of air travel can be. The crash of Delta Flight 1823 was a turning point for aviation safety, and it didn't go unnoticed by Delta Airlines. In the aftermath, the airline took swift action to reassess its policies and procedures. Delta made significant changes to its maintenance protocols, ensuring that all aircraft undergo even more rigorous inspections before every flight. The airline also implemented stricter training for its pilots, emphasizing the importance of decision-making in extreme conditions. Pilots are now required to undergo additional hours of training on how to handle adverse weather conditions, such as icy runways and high winds, to ensure that they can make the best decisions in critical moments. Delta also introduced more comprehensive fatigue management policies for its crew members, ensuring they don't operate flights when they are overworked or underrested. On a broader scale, the crash led to industry-wide changes in aviation safety measures. The incident sparked new regulations from aviation authorities, requiring all airlines to upgrade their systems for detecting and reporting potential aircraft malfunctions. There were also new guidelines introduced for how airports handle runway conditions, especially in extreme weather, with stricter rules about snow and ice removal. These changes were designed to prevent similar disasters in the future and to ensure that planes could stop safely, even in challenging conditions. Could the Delta crash have been prevented? In hindsight, it seems there were multiple points at which disaster could have been avoided. If the pilots had better assessed the weather conditions on the runway surface, they might have decided to delay the landing. If the maintenance crew had caught the issues with the aircraft's braking system, the outcome could have been different. And if the airport had been quicker to clear the ice from the runway, the plane might not have lost traction. But as with many accidents, it was a chain of small mistakes and oversights that added up to something far worse. This tragedy serves as a reminder that safety must always come first, and the smallest details shouldn't be overlooked. So, are we safer flying today because of this incident? The answer is yes. While the crash was a tragic event, it led to crucial changes in how airlines and airports operate. The improvements in maintenance, pilot training, and safety regulations have made flying safer for everyone. Passengers today can be more confident that the lessons learned from Flight 1823 have made air travel safer than ever before. This incident showed the world just how fragile air safety can be, but it also led to advancements that ensure better protection for passengers and crews alike. The crash of Delta Flight 1823 was a wake-up call that highlighted just how important aviation safety is. Thanks to advances in technology and stricter regulations, flying today is safer than ever. However, the real question is, do you think the crash could have been prevented? Could the airline or the airport have done something differently to stop the disaster from happening? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so don't hesitate to drop a comment below. If you're interested in more stories like this one, where we dive deep into real-life events and uncover what happened, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our future updates. And if you found this story as gripping as we did, give it a thumbs up. It really helps others find this video too. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you in the next video.